London, January 4th, 1698. It begins in a laundry room. A Dutch woman employed in the palace leaves linen drying too close to a charcoal brazier. By the time anyone notices, the wooden corridors are already burning. The fire spreads through the night, and by morning, the largest palace in Europe, larger than Versailles, larger than the Vatican, is ash and rubble. It took 150 years to build. It was gone in a single night. This video is about 4 royal palaces that no longer exist. Richmond, beloved retreat of Elizabeth I. Greenwich, birthplace of 3 Tudor monarchs. Nonsuch, Henry VIII's vanity project, built on the ruins of a village he erased from the map. And Whitehall, the palace you just saw burn. Using surviving paintings, engravings, and modern AI reconstruction, this is what they actually looked like, and what happened to them. 10 miles upriver from London, on a sweeping bend of the Thames, stood the palace Henry VII built to announce that the Tudor dynasty had arrived. Before it was Richmond, this site was called Sheen, a royal residence since the 14th century. In January 1497, it burned to the ground. The fire started in the king's own bedchamber. Henry VII's response was to build something entirely new on the same site, and to rename it. Richmond was his own earldom before he became king. He wasn't just rebuilding a palace, he was putting his name on the landscape. What you're seeing here is the only detailed record we have of what Richmond looked like at its peak. The west front, sketched by Antonis van den Wijngaarde in 1562. The distinctive domed towers, the riverside setting, the sheer scale of the complex rising directly from the Thames. These palaces were built on the river deliberately. The Thames was the road. Monarchs and their courts travelled between residences by royal barge, moving with the seasons, the river connecting one palace to the next. Richmond became the favourite. Elizabeth I returned here every spring for decades. She hunted in the parklands, received ambassadors in the Great Hall, used it as a refuge from the noise and politics of London. She came back for the last time in the winter of 1602. She was 69 years old and her health was failing. What followed was one of the stranger episodes of the entire Tudor era. In the final weeks of her life, Elizabeth refused to go to bed. She sat on cushions on the floor of her chamber, unable to speak, refusing food, refusing medicine. Her counsellors were desperate. England had no named successor, and the Queen wouldn't or couldn't tell them who it should be. They needed an answer. She gave them nothing. She died on the 24th of March, 1603, in the palace she had always preferred, with the question still unresolved. A messenger rode north that same night to inform James VI of Scotland that he was now King of England. James had no particular attachment to Richmond. He visited occasionally, granted it to his wife Anne of Denmark, and moved on. A palace defined entirely by one monarch's affection for it had no obvious purpose once that monarch was gone. The Civil War finished it. Parliament stripped the lead from the roofs, sold the contents, and the building began its slow dissolution, stone by stone, decade by decade, carted away and repurposed elsewhere. What had taken 4 years to build took a century to disappear. 8 miles downstream from Richmond, where the Thames widens and the air carries a hint of the sea, stood a palace known by 2 names. The English called it Greenwich. Its official name was Placentia, the pleasant place, a title given to it by Margaret of Anjou in the 15th century, when she took the site from its previous owner and claimed it for the crown. The Tudors inherited both the building and the name, rebuilt it extensively, and made it something the earlier structure never was, the dynastic heartbeat of a royal family. Here is the palace as it sat on the Thames, close enough to the water that royal barges could dock directly at its steps. And out on the river itself, the traffic of an empire, merchant vessels, naval ships, the constant movement of a waterway. that connected this palace to every corner of the known world. And here, from the hill above, you can see why it was chosen. The parkland rising steeply behind, the river curving below, London visible on the horizon. These were working palaces, but they were also statements. The setting was part of the architecture. On the 28th of June, 1491, a boy was born here who was never supposed to be king. His name was Henry. His elder brother Arthur was the heir, the one who had been groomed for the throne, betrothed to a Spanish princess, sent to govern Wales. Henry was the spare. He grew up at Greenwich, learned to joust in its tilt yard, developed the outsized appetites and competitive instincts that would define his reign. Then Arthur died. He was 15 years old, probably of sweating sickness, 6 months into his marriage. Henry was 10. Within 7 years, he was King of England. The boy who grew up in these courtyards became Henry VIII, the monarch who dissolved the monasteries, broke with Rome, executed 2 of his 6 wives, and reshaped England so completely that the reverberations are still felt today. All of that began here in a palace on the Thames. And Greenwich didn't just produce Henry, it produced the dynasty. Mary I was born here in 1516. Elizabeth I in 1533. 3 monarchs, Henry, Mary, Elizabeth, born in the same building across 42 years. No other palace in England concentrates that much consequence in a single site. It was also at Greenwich that Henry VIII's world began to unravel. His attempts to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the crisis that would become known as the Great Matter, played out partly in these rooms. Anne Boleyn's rise happened in this court. The break with Rome, which transformed England from a Catholic kingdom into something new and uncertain, was set in motion by a king sitting in a palace overlooking the Thames at Greenwich. Edward VI, Henry's only legitimate son, the Protestant boy king, died here in 1553 at the age of 15. In his final weeks, desperate to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from inheriting, he signed away the succession to his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. 9 days after Jane was proclaimed queen, Mary rode into London at the head of an army. Jane was in the Tower. Greenwich had witnessed the last throe of a dying dynasty. By the early 17th century, the palace was deteriorating, structurally compromised, visually incoherent, no longer adequate for a working court. Charles II began demolishing it around 1660, intending to replace it with something grander. He ran out of money after 1 wing. William III, who disliked the damp Thames air for health reasons, gave the site to the Navy. Christopher Wren designed the Royal Naval Hospital that stands there today, the great Baroque twin domes that now define the Greenwich skyline. The palace that produced 3 Tudor monarchs was demolished to build a hospital for sailors. The building that replaced it is, by any measure, more magnificent than what it replaced. Greenwich's particular fate was not neglect or accident. It was simply superseded. The Royal Naval Hospital still stands. You can visit it today. In the spring of 1538, Henry VIII made a decision that would erase an entire community from the map of England. He had seen the great palaces of Europe. Francis I of France had built Chambord, vast, theatrical, unmistakably a statement of royal power. The Holy Roman Emperor had his own monuments to dynastic ambition. Henry, who measured himself obsessively against his continental rivals, wanted something that would surpass them all. He chose a site in Surrey, 12 miles south of London, and he cleared it. The village of Cuddington had existed for centuries. It had a church, a manor, farms, a community of people who had lived and worked and been buried there across generations. Henry purchased the land. The transaction was recorded. What was not recorded, what was apparently not considered worth recording, was what happened to the people themselves. We don't know their names. We don't know whether they were compensated beyond the land purchase or simply told to leave. The church where they had buried their dead was pulled down, its stone recycled into the foundations of what was coming. The parish of Cuddington ceased to exist. The historical record moves straight from the village being there to the village being gone, as if the people in between were an administrative detail too minor to mention. On the cleared ground, Henry built Nonsuch. These paintings and engravings are the only visual records we have of what it looked like. The Flemish artist Joris Hoefnagel drew it in 1568, the most precise surviving record of the decorated facade. What it shows is unlike anything else built in England before or since. The upper story was covered entirely in carved and painted stucco panels. Classical gods, Roman emperors, allegorical figures, executed by Flemish and Italian craftsmen brought to England specifically for this project. It was a palace that spoke the visual language of Renaissance Europe, assembled by a king who wanted Europe to know he belonged in that conversation. And then, Henry VIII never spent a single night there. He died in January 1547 with Nonsuch still incomplete. He had destroyed a village, displaced an entire community, spent a fortune on craftsmen imported from across the continent, and never used the building he built. The palace passed through several hands, was eventually completed, and spent the following decades in intermittent royal use. Elizabeth I acquired it in 1592 and used it regularly in the final decade of her reign, hunting in the parklands, the same pleasure she had taken at Richmond. After Elizabeth, it drifted. Too small for a working court, too far from London for daily government. In 1670, Charles II gave it to his mistress, Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, the dominant figure of the early Restoration court, a woman of considerable political influence and equally considerable debt. Barbara Villiers accepted the gift. She used it briefly. And then, in 1682, she began selling it. Not abandoning it, not letting it decay quietly, selling it methodically, deliberately, piece by piece. The lead came off the roof, then the timber from the internal structure, then the stonework, and then the stucco panels, the greatest Renaissance decorative program ever executed in England. Irreplaceable, unique, were prized from the walls and sold as building material. The carved faces of Roman emperors, the allegorical figures that craftsmen had spent years creating, broken up and sold as rubble. It took 6 years. The palace that had taken a decade to build, that had stood for over a century, was systematically converted into cash to clear a gambling debt. By 1688, it was gone. For the next 3 centuries, historians couldn't agree on exactly where it had stood. The name survived: Nonsuch Park, Nonsuch High School, attached to a landscape with no physical trace of the building. It wasn't until excavations in the 1950s that the foundations were finally located and the full footprint of the palace mapped for the first time. Beneath those foundations, archaeologists found something else: the outline of Cuddington Church. The parish Henry VIII had erased to build his palace was still there, underneath it, preserved in the earth, outlasting everything that had been built on top of it. We began here. January 1698. A laundry fire, the largest palace in Europe, reduced to ash in a single night. But to understand what burned, you need to understand what Whitehall actually was. Because it wasn't really a palace in any conventional sense. It was an accident. Henry VIII acquired the core of it in 1530 from Cardinal Wolsey, who had built himself a residence on the Thames that was frankly more impressive than anything the king owned in London. Henry took it. Wolsey was in no position to object, and immediately started adding to it. A tilt yard, tennis courts, a cockpit for gambling, a bowling alley. Successive monarchs added more. Galleries, lodgings, courtyards, gatehouses. Nobody ever sat down and designed Whitehall. It simply accumulated. This painting gives you a sense of what that accumulation looked like from the river. And this view from St. James's Park shows the result from the other side, the banqueting house. Inigo Jones's classical masterpiece, sitting incongruously among medieval towers and timber-framed ranges that belong to a completely different architectural world. 2,000 rooms, 23 acres, a public road running straight through the middle of it that was never closed. Carts, tradespeople, anyone with business in Westminster passed through the heart of the royal residence every day. Foreign ambassadors required guides to navigate it. The king's own servants got lost in its corridors. In 1649, the chaos of Whitehall became the backdrop for the most dramatic single moment in its history. Charles I had been tried for treason against his own people and condemned to death. On the morning of the 30th of January, he walked through the banqueting house. Beneath the ceiling, Rubens had painted showing his father ascending to heaven, and stepped out through a hole cut in the first-floor window onto a scaffold erected against the outside wall. He was executed in front of a crowd gathered in the street below. The King of England, put to death by his own parliament, outside his own palace, in public. The banqueting house still stands. It is the only part of Whitehall that survived what came next. After the monarchy was restored in 1660, there were serious proposals to rebuild Whitehall properly. Inigo Jones had already drawn up plans for a complete replacement, a vast, coherent classical palace that would have been the greatest building in Britain. The money was never found. The medieval chaos continued to accumulate around the one building Jones had actually completed, the banqueting house standing among the disorder like an argument nobody had the funds to finish. Then came the night of January 4th, 1698. The fire moved fast through the dry wooden ranges, the accumulated construction of 150 years, packed tightly together, tinder in a cold winter. By morning, it was over. The stone banqueting house held. Everything else, the galleries, the lodgings, the tilt yard, the gambling rooms, the 2,000 rooms of royal chaos, was gone. William III, who had never liked Whitehall and had long preferred Kensington for the cleaner air away from the river, did not rebuild. The site was too complicated, the cost too uncertain. The palace that had been the centre of English royal life for 150 years was simply abandoned. The most chaotic royal residence in Europe had simplified itself, in a single night, to a single building. That building still stands on Whitehall today. You can walk past it, most people do, without knowing that they are looking at the only surviving fragment of a palace larger than Versailles, and that everything around it, in every direction, was once part of the same extraordinary, ungovernable, irreplaceable complex that burned on a January night because someone left laundry too close to a fire. 4 palaces, hundreds of years of history, gone, every one of them, for reasons that had nothing to do with their scale or their ambition. A laundry fire, a gambling debt, neglect, obsolescence. They were built to outlast everything. As it turned out, everything outlasted them. But the past is closer than it looks. If you'd like to see another lost place brought back to life, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this one, a like and a subscribe helps make the next video possible. We'll see you in the next one.